Hello, my name is Janice Masood Paul, and welcome to Choosing a Repository for Your Research Data. So this afternoon, we're going to cover why you need a research data repository, types of research data repositories, using FAIR principles to choose a repository, and finding a repository that meets your needs. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'll make sure that I check that at the end of the presentation. A research data repository is a virtual place to store and preserve data that result from the research process. Now, there are several reasons you may need a repository. If your grant came from a government agency, they may require that you deposit your data in publicly accessible repositories. Increasingly, journal publishers also require data sets be made available when the article is published. Now, although a repository may not be explicitly required, you may be asked to choose or share your data, and just posting it on your website typically won't provide the same discoverability or ease of use. Finally, because research data repositories provide reliable long-term storage and access to research data, you may want to use a repository to ensure your data is secure, properly archived, and preserved, even if you don't plan to share it. There are several types of repositories. Some funders, like the NIH, host repositories where you can submit your research data when your project is complete. Disciplinary repositories are typically supported and managed by professional organizations. Your repository may have, your discipline may have a repository that all your colleagues go to for information on the topic. So for example, FlyBase is the place for genetic data on fruit flies. General repositories like Zenodo or Figshare cover many fields of study. Sometimes there just aren't disciplinary repositories that meet all your needs, and your data may be of interest to many disciplines, and you want to maximize discovery. So those could be some reasons to put it in a general repository. Institutional repositories store the assets of an organization. Not all institutional repositories can accept all types of data. So for example, Drexel's repository, IDEA, primarily stores theses and dissertations, but also contains documents written by Drexel faculty and Drexel researchers in PDF format, such as published articles or posters. Now, with all these choices, what should you consider when choosing a repository? Funders and publishers may have specific requirements, and it's important to follow them closely. But you may have additional concerns. So for example, can the repository manage your file type? And are there file size restrictions? What about the cost structure? There may be repository costs after you deposit your research output. Have you accounted for these long-term costs in your grant budget? It's desirable, though not essential, that a repository meet certification standards. You should also confirm that the repository incorporates FAIR principles to make the data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Let's spend a little more time with FAIR principles. Data's findable if it's uniquely and persistently identifiable. So does the repository register your data to create a persistent identifier, such as a DOI? Does the repository provide for rich metadata that will help other researchers discover it? Will your research output and data be indexed in Google? Data is accessible if it can be understood by either machines or human beings, and they can get to it through standard protocols that allow for authorization or authentication if necessary. Data objects are interoperable if the metadata and data are machine readable, and those machines speak to each other using standard, preferably open formats, and shared terminology. Finally, data objects are reusable if the data can be automatically linked to the source and the source is properly cited. It's important any licensing and terms of use for your data are upfront and clear. There are certification standards that were developed for repositories, like the Core Trust Seal of Approval and the Trustworthy Repositories Audit and Certification Criteria Checklist. However, since repository certification is still in its infancy, I wouldn't rule out a repository just because it didn't achieve certification yet. On the other hand, you may want to consider some of the questions asked in the certification checklist. Ultimately, you need to know who's responsible for the repository. Are they financially viable? Is your data secure, backed up, and properly preserved? And do they have contingency plans in place if the repository shuts down or changes scope? So now that we're armed with selection criteria, there are several ways you can find a repository if your funder or publisher doesn't specify one. You may want to consider looking in registries or directories. We'll take a look at a few examples, starting with a disciplinary repository. Data One is a registry for earth and environmental data. It's a community-driven project providing access to data across multiple member repositories. I did a search in Data One for climate migration, and it provided me with repositories that store data sets on that topic, along with geographical indicators for the location of each study. Now, if you can't find a suitable repository in a disciplinary registry, you can try a general registry. re3data.org is a global registry that includes data repositories from various academic disciplines. A keyword search for COVID yields repositories related to COVID-19. Now you can limit by content to find repositories that accept audio-visual data, databases, raw data source code, and more. Data access filters indicate which repositories accept data with access restrictions, things like embargoed data, closed data, or restricted data. You can also search directories from funders and publishers. So we talked about NIH a little bit earlier, but NIH repositories include NIH-supported data accessible for reuse. Most accept submissions of appropriate data from NIH-funded investigators and others, but some are more restrictive and may limit access to a specific set of researchers. So for example, you can see that this area works with domain-specific repositories that house data of a specific type or discipline, but then they have a category that has limitations on submitting and accessing data. This third generalist repository category will accept data regardless of the type of format, content, or subject matter. Publishers also have directories, and publishers like PLOS have identified a set of established repositories that are trusted and recognized within their respective communities. Let's click on the PLOS link and take a look at their repositories. So as you can see, it states here that all data and software underlying reported findings should be deposited in appropriate public repositories. Preferably, that would be a subject-specific repository, but if you can't locate one, a cross-disciplinary generalist repository. And if you scroll down, you're going to see a number of repositories that are probably really familiar to you, like Dryad, Figshare, the Harvard Dataverse, Open Science Framework, and Zenodo. These are repositories that have been around for some time, not likely to go anywhere anytime soon. As you scroll down, though, you're going to see repositories listed by discipline, and these are very broad categories. But again, They're pretty familiar. So under physical sciences, you'll find Pangea. Under sequencing, repositories like GenBank, and then ICPSR for the social sciences. Scientific Data is a peer-reviewed open access journal for descriptions of data sets and research that advance sharing and reuse of scientific data. Now, they mandate that you share your data, but they don't actually host it themselves. Instead, they have an evaluated list of data repositories to ensure that they meet requirements for data access, preservation, and stability. Let's click on that link. So here's the page for scientific data repositories. And again, they mentioned that data should be submitted to discipline-specific community-recognized repositories whenever possible, or to generalist repositories if there is no suitable community resource available. If we take a look at their generalist repositories, they should look very familiar because they're pretty much all the repositories that we saw listed under PLOS. But they give you a little bit more information because they tell you how much it's going to cost for your data sets and what is the maximum size for each data set that's allowed. I'm going to scroll up and take a look at some of the discipline-specific repositories. Let's look at health sciences. So here's their health science category. And most of these repositories in this list are suitable for data sets requiring restricted data access. That might be needed to preserve study participant privacy in clinical data sets. So you can see that most of these columns have some type of restricted data access, and all of them will link to fairsharing.org. Fairsharing.org is a searchable portal of registries, and that contains descriptions of repository standards, databases, and data policies. For an example, I'm going to take a look at the Cancer Imaging Archive. And if you've never used that service before, it de-identifies and hosts medical images of cancer for public download. It's a really great site. I'm going to click on the fairsharing.org link for that so you can see the types of information that you can find in fairsharing.org. So it will give you a general description of an archive and repository regardless of the archive. So here it is for cancer imaging archives. But then beyond that general description, if we scroll down a bit, you can see it will give you support information for each archive or repository. Now, most of the support is on the archive page itself, but then they also have communities within social media, like on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, where you can speak to other people who are using the archive and get additional information. You can also find information about protocols for data collection, de-identification, and curation. So some of that information is listed here. If there are publications about the archive, they will often list some of the key publications on that site. For the most part, you can find this type of information under fairsharing.org for most popular repositories. Some list even more information. So those were just a few examples of directories and registries that you can use to find repositories if they're not specified in your grant. I'm going to wrap this up. Just say in summary, we looked at why you would need to use a research repository, types of research repositories, some criteria to consider when you're choosing a repository, and how to find a repository that meets your needs. If you have any questions about selecting a repository or questions about repositories in general, you can feel free to contact me. Again, I'm Janice Masood Paul. You can contact me at the email address listed in the slide. And I also want to encourage you to take a look at our Research Data Repositories Library Guide. The address is listed here. Thank you. Hi, Jay.
Oh, hi, Janice. Great presentation. Very nice
Oh,
and
thank you.
informative. But I was wondering if um, all these requirements by different funding agencies submitting your data, how many researchers are actually submitting data in those repositories? And how do we know they are depositing? Are there any evaluation? Are there any assessment these agencies that they are submitting it? And the second question is, if there is a university or institution that has its own server, and if they are submitting their data in that server, can they refer to that server as a repository in the grant?
So I'll address your second question first, Jay. And yes, they can refer to an institutional repository, but it really depends on the grant. So in some cases, they may have to submit that data in more than one place. If you apply for an NSF grant, for example, a lot of the data that underlies the project would have to go into NSF PAR. Now that would include the publication, but different directorates may have different requirements. So if they want you to submit your data in a particular repository, then you would still have to do that, but you could put it in the repository for your institution as well. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
yeah.
Yeah, so it really depends on what the grant is asking for.
So, okay.
In terms of requirements, so you read a lot, especially when it comes to publishers, and I'm trying to remember which one mentions it. Might have been PLOS, where they said if you, let's say you said you were going to deposit your data in a certain place, and you did that, but then you withdrew it, that they could withdraw your publication
Oh,
from their site as well. Whether or not they actually do it, though, is another question. So some of them seem to be putting in more requirements that have a little bit more teeth,
hmm,
but it's hard to say yet if they are actually following through on all those requirements.
it's quite challenging, and a lot of somebody has to do a lot of monitoring, especially when they're evaluating grant submissions.
Can you imagine how much time it would take to enforce that?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So it's hard to say, but they are adding requirements.
And I also recently I was exploring Google data search, and in that you can search for different repositories, and you can select a particular domain. Like if you're looking for all the data reposited at site, uh, uh, say .data.gov, for example. So if I type nanomaterials as an example, and if I search for site in data.gov, filter with that, it will pull up all the nanomaterials related data repositories as submitted in those government funded sites.
That's really cool. And that's another reason that I think it's important if you're going to put your data in a repository, when we were talking about some of those FAIR criteria, to make sure that it's findable. So at the
Exactly,
very least, if you search Google, you ought to be able to find it. Otherwise, it's just like a data dumpster. Your data disappears, but it might be great, but nobody knows it's there.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah, Google is that's something that I actually need to mention explicitly because it is a really good source for finding data.
And it takes you to Statista also, right? So all
Oh
the
yeah,
data
yeah, yeah.
from Statista is also included. So if you are logged into Drexel Network with Statista open, you can actually access full data because we have subscription to it.
Right. Yes, I forgot about that one too. I think that's maybe something that we should add to our guide
Yes, we should.
to help people. Yeah.
Mhm.
So we make a note of that. Did you have any other questions? Or hi, Doreen. I didn't know if you had a question.
She had a chat question,
Oh,
I
did
think.
she? I'm
Yeah, there
sorry.
is a question in chat. Do you want me to read it? Can you see
Please.
the
Now,
chat,
now I
Janice?
can. It's hard to see it sometimes when you're, otherwise I would have tried. Yes, please. Ah,
It just
okay.
popped up. It says, there are a fee to use the repositories.
Yes and no. So, so Doreen, it really depends on the repository itself. So earlier when we were looking at scientific data, there was a link they had to different general datas, and they told you what some of the limitations were in terms of the size of the data set. But in the column next to that, they also mentioned something about cost. So some of them, and I believe, and Jay, you can correct me on this, I believe that Figshare
Yes,
charges in some cases, and in some cases it doesn't.
it
There's
depends
some
upon how
limits.
much your subscription. There's some limitation of. They do give some amount of data free, but beyond that, there is some charge.
Yeah, and I again, I could be wrong, but it seems to me that Figshare didn't allow you to store a whole lot before they charge you, whereas the Noto is free.
Yes. And the advantage, the only limitation that I found in Figshare, one of the limitations is that search of interface that they have is not so good.
Mm.
But I am able to search Figshare.com within Google datasets, right? So,
Okay.
so if I want all the data on so climate change, for example, then if I go to Google dataset, I can just put climate change and then cite uh, Figshare.com.
Okay, so Google
Okay.
sounds as if it's a
Then it pulls up.
good alternative.
Yeah.
You can, yeah, certainly for finding things and for
Right.
storing things. Did you have a grant that you're working with?
No, I'm a student in the
Mm-hmm.
DHSC program,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm just taking advantage of all these seminars.
Oh, okay. Okay, very good.
Yeah.
So even, I mean, even if you don't have a grant that you're working on now, it's possible that
Okay.
you may. So if you have a situation where you want to put your data in a repository or a publication, you can always contact the library for assistance with that, because we may be able to find a repository that will meet your needs that won't charge you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Thank you both.
Okay. You're welcome. Oh, okay. So Jay has put that in the chat, that link to Google Data Search, Doreen. So you may want to grab that.
Thank you, Jay.
You're welcome. And make sure that you take advantage of something. Say, I'm just putting one example. Like, say, for example, I am say, for example, I'm looking for nanomaterials data for in a governmental website. So then I type my keyword, and then just you put site colon data.gov, or you could do nanomaterials or any topic of your interest, and then say site column figshare.com. So then it will search only in that repository for that particular data.
Good tip. Thank you. Were there any other questions?
This is an evolving topic, Janice. It will continue to grow and evolve as we have more things come up in the repositories, our
And
faculty.
more requirements. I had sent something out this morning about updated requirements from the NIH.
Yeah,
Yeah, so they pushed that date out. It seems like as far as they possibly could. It's January of 2023. I mean, they've been deliberating about this now for a year at least, and then they pushed it out 2 years. But it's certainly by that time they'll have it nailed down.
yeah.
So
That's great. Thank you, Janice. This was
you're
great.
very welcome. You're very welcome. So thank you everyone for coming.